Welcome to the next memory lecture. We're going to start today by looking at a story from the news, and it's, ironically enough, a story about the news in the news. Anyway, you might remember this story from around summer 2015, in which the probably most trusted news anchor in the United States was a guy named Brian Williams. He had been a reporter for a very long time before he eventually became the nightly NBC news anchor. Nightly news on NBC being an important news show at the time and still today. Lester Holt was named the new permanent anchor as soon as Brian Williams was demoted. And I want to tell you about the story of why this happened to Brian Williams, because it's going to be reflected in our lesson in this video, which is related, of course, to our memory. Brian Williams made a memory error. And so to throw back to the previous video, our system of memory is so sophisticated that it can recognize 90% of our high school classmates 25 years later. But that same system can fail in ways that are really, really obvious, and in the case of Brian Williams, led to a demotion and a change in his career. So what you see really clearly in that story is that his story changed over time, and it resulted in a really negative effect to his overall career. I think now he anchors something on MSNBC every now and then. He's doing, I don't want to suggest that he was totally ruined. He had already made lots of money and has been very okay ever since. I don't think he lost a contract or anything, but he lost a lot of prestige. People lost their trust in him as a news anchor. And the reason that all this happened to him is actually based on how our memory system is structured. So today we'll talk about recall by virtue of context. We'll talk about how tenuous the nature of our memory for context and source can be. And the last sort of important feature today is that you're going to be able to explain not only that deep processing leads to longer retention, which you already know, but you will be able to explain why deep processing leads to longer retention. All these are related to how false memories are developed. And basically, all three of those things contribute to where does this kind of story come from? Again, how can this sophisticated memory system make such a grievous error? One reason, as we've already discussed, is that memory is a lot like perception in that it is constructed moment to moment. We talked about how perception is a construction of all the different sensations you're experiencing combined with the knowledge, expectations, and context in your mind about that situation. And remember that memory is all that same stuff reconstructed. So it does its best to be a faithful representation, a faithful reconstruction of that moment, but it makes errors all the time. Most of the time those errors are small or benign or not interesting or totally unnoticed. But what you remember, like what you perceive, may not be the true state of the world. If we can fool your visual system with illusions, how can your memory system also how could it not be also fallible? It makes good sense that these two systems that are so closely linked would be similarly fallible. Again, remember, memory is more like a Wikipedia page than a video camera. You can look up an article and it'll link you to all the relevant articles. They all become active the moment you think about it. That is memory's networked nature. It's easier to come up with something if you're thinking about something related. It's easier to answer a question if you're given some cue. It's much easier to answer a multiple choice question than a short answer question because you are engaging in recognition, not recall, and the recognition only requires you to find the previous pattern of brain activity, of mental activity, not to generate it all over. You don't have to search Wikipedia, you just have to click the relevant link. And most of the time, these errors we make are based on inferences that our mind has made about the situation around us, most often subconsciously. Most of the time, these suggestions don't come from someone else. Again, they are not obvious, they're not overt, we're not actively thinking about the inferences we're making. But they really do influence our memory quite strongly. And again, they're based on our experiences and knowledge. So a lot of what is kind of filling in the details of the specifics in our memories are facts that are kind of implied by the situation in the memory, implied by the to-be-remembered information, but aren't explicitly part of the memory itself, or maybe weren't even explicitly shown or stated at the time. And this is all okay. It works really well most of the time because our mind is set up to make really pragmatic and useful inferences based on our knowledge that we've gained through experience. The system is very good at doing this. It's very good at moving from one Wikipedia page to the next, one memory node to another. And it typically serves us very, very well, but sometimes it doesn't. So I'll give you the first example of a very important and revealing false memory study. This was conducted by Loftus and Palmer in 1974. They showed their subjects a film of a car crash. And after the crash, they asked a bunch of questions about the film, one of which was about how fast were the cars going when they blanked into each other. And they filled in that blank with 5 different verbs depending on the subject. So they had something like 20 or 30 people probably, so 5 or 6 people saw each verb. So we've got all 5 verbs here, and then they asked all the people to make an estimate of how fast the cars were going again. And I'll pause here and ask you to think about what you think the differences might be here. Do you think the verb used in the question affected everybody's speed estimate? They all watched the same video. Should they make equal speed estimates? Or do you think the verb will affect their estimate? You might already, because I just told you this is a false memory study. How do you think it did so? I think people are going to have higher speed estimates for contacted or for smashed. And so there's a really nice effect here where from contacted to smashed we see a 9 mile per hour difference in speed estimates that moves throughout the sort of intensity of each of these verbs. Contacted, hit, bumped, collided, smashed, all result in higher and higher estimates of speed. And then even more interesting, a week later, they asked the people who had seen the verb smashed, and people who were asked about speed with the verb hit, whether they saw any broken glass. And there was not any broken glass in the video. So for the people who saw hit, about 14 of them accidentally said, yeah, I saw broken glass, even though they shouldn't have. And that number more than doubles in the smashed condition. So if they heard the word smashed at the time, it changed their memory of the event because they made, again, a pragmatic inference about what must have happened. If the cars smashed into each other, there probably was broken glass. Smashing sounds like breaking. There probably was something on the ground, even if I don't explicitly remember it. On the other hand, if they just hit each other, maybe not. And so those people maybe depended more on the specifics of their actual memory. They didn't have this other verb to fill in those details. They didn't have as much information from which to infer anything about the hardness of the crash. And they made lower speed estimates. So both of those things could be informing their inference about their memory a week later. So that brings us to another important point, which is that as the true details of the memory fade away in our long-term memory, in our mind, we rely more and more on these inferences to fill in everything we don't remember surrounding them. And this is because, as we previously discussed, memory depends on what actually happened, what you truly remember, but also your knowledge, your experiences, and expectations. Right after an event, it probably depends mostly on what actually happened. But as time continues on and your memory of the event itself decays, our knowledge and expectations fill in more of the cracks surrounding what we remember of what actually happened. Remember that memory is not a video that is constantly replayed. It is a reconstruction of a previous perception experience based on multiple pieces of information. Nicely stated in the video linked here by Dr. Beth Loftus. Here's another example of false childhood memories. This work is done by Ira Hyman and some colleagues back in the 90s. They had participants parents fill out a questionnaire about the participants' childhood. So these are students at their university. Those students then were interviewed about the experiences that their parents described in the questionnaire. So they asked them about some of the real experiences, and then they also added some false ones. For example, something like a birthday party at age 5 with pizza and a clown. And so what they found is that people recalled lots of details from the true events, almost 100% in most of the cases, and more throughout the 3 interviews. For the false events, none of their 51 participants would say that they remembered anything about the false event at their first interview. But in the second interview, 9 people started to produce details from an event that never happened. And in the third interview, more people began to produce details about an event that never happened. And again, this is because they're making inferences. They're starting to figure, all right, this person keeps pushing on me. They have all this other true information. Maybe this one's true too. Maybe I should try really hard to remember it. And so in this case, it seems like we're willing to generate a memory that has no actual content to it based entirely on the cue we're given and our knowledge expectations and references about that situation. Here's an example, by the way, of some of the data from the Hyman study. In interview 1, we have the interviewer saying, we have this birthday party at age 5. The subject says, oh, I don't remember anything from that. Maybe there's a girl named Molly. Say anything else? I don't know, maybe McDonald's. We went to McDonald Land. Ronald McDonald came out. And the interviewer says, okay, I've got pizza, ice cream, and a clown. And the subject says, oh, okay, a clown, huh, interesting. All right. And then they move on to the next topic. So this is a false event that this person never experienced. Then in interview 2, the subject really interestingly combines the information that they remembered or that they sort of generated along with the stuff made up by the interviewer. So they say, we were in McDonald's, the clown came in, we had cupcakes, sat on toadstools, 13 to 14 people sitting around a table, and we had pizza. Anything else you can think of? They say no. So remember, this production of these false memories is based entirely on inferences made from these conversations. And interestingly, in this case, it totally subverts what you might normally expect about a birthday party at a McDonald's when you were 5. Why would you have pizza and ice cream at a McDonald's? You should have burgers and McFlurries, right? So this person was so influenced by the suggestion and the context built by the interviewer that they kind of lost track of even their regular memory system, and it was leaned on to cause them to produce a false memory. So this can happen. We have to be careful for these kinds of falsely produced memories. People don't often intentionally try to cause each other to produce false memories, but when it happens, it looks like it's actually quite easy sometimes. Part of the reason that this works is that one of the most tenuous features of memory is our ability to meta-remember where it came from. So a problem that this interviewee is having is that they can't quite remember why they have McDonald's and toadstools and cupcakes and pizza in their head. Why are all those details there? They don't remember that they were only just planted there by the interviewer in the previous interview. They just know that they have the details. And it turns out that the source of a memory, the source of a piece of information, can sometimes be the most tenuous feature of our memories network. You've probably had several of these experiences of knowing that you know something or feeling like you remember something, but not being able to remember where you remember it from. Maybe you've told a person a story before and they've gone, yeah, I was there. And you go, oh, right. That's a feature. That's a fail of the source monitoring of our memory. So it seems like it might be perhaps the most fragile feature. So psychologists call this source monitoring in the idea that source memory is our process, or whatever it is, our mental faculty for determining the origins of our memories. Where do I remember that from? And so we make a source monitoring error when we misidentify the source of our memory. Sometimes they call those source misattributions. But again, the easiest example is sharing a story with someone or giving them some kind of factoid to only find out after you finish that they're the one who told you that fact the day before. Another source monitoring study I really like was run by Larry Jacoby in 1989. They called this Becoming Famous Overnight. So in the first phase, the participants read a list of names they'd never seen before, and then they had an immediate test in which they were supposed to try to remember the names that they had just read, so the read non-famous names, and then they were also trying to identify some new non-famous names. So they were basically being tested on, do you remember this from the list you just read or not? And then they were also shown some famous names, and then they were asked which of these are famous people. And so most of the time they were very correct. They didn't identify any of the non-famous names from the list or any of the new non-famous names as famous people, and they identified the famous names as famous people. Then they went away for a day, came back to the lab 24 hours later, and took that same test again. Here's a big list of names. Just tell us which ones are famous. And some of the non-famous names from that first list that they read at the beginning were misidentified as famous. So what that means is the non-famous names now had some kind of feeling of familiarity to them. They knew that they remembered those names from somewhere, and they misattributed the source of that familiarity. They failed to identify the source of the memory and forgot that it was the list that they read the previous day and just figured it was because the person was famous. So these source monitoring errors are very easy to generate, and they happen all the time to us. But this same structure can lead us to take advantage of our memory and use it for good, as well as these psychologists who have used it for evil. One example you already know of that is levels of processing, originally posited by Fergus Craik alongside others who had similar ideas at the same time. You might remember that there are shallow, medium, and deep potential types of processing. There's another interesting effect out there called survival processing that has been used a lot by Dr. Jim Nairn. And the task there is to, rather than think about your emotional response to a word or the color of the font of the word, to think about how you might use it on a deserted island. And that leads to pretty deep processing as well, and good memory. And so what's going on here is these deeper levels of processing are making more connections between the to-be-remembered material, in this case the word in the list, and our networks. It's connecting to more networks because you're thinking, first of all, about yourself in this emotional response or in how you would use this on an island. You're thinking creatively when you use the deserted island example. You're thinking about the function of the item. When you think about your emotional response, you're thinking about your emotions. When you're thinking about whether it's larger than a grapefruit, you're comparing it to other items. All these things give you more connections in the network of your mind. You are widening the pattern of activity that could possibly be used or accessed to remember the word. Thus, your memory network is being activated to encourage you to remember it better, to give you more routes for retrieval, which will lead to better memory, longer retention, and more retention at first. But again, this leaves us open to the power of suggestion. So there's been a lot of really excellent work on the misinformation effect, originally pioneered by Elizabeth Loftus. It's based on the idea that misleading or suggestive information presented after you witness an event can change how you describe the event later. So I already gave you some example of that with the hit versus smashed example from Loftus and Palmer in '74. If you watch the video linked to on this slide, you'll see some more interesting work, hear about more interesting stuff that Loftus has done over the years. But I want to give you an example right now. So watch and memorize the words I'm about to show you as they appear on the screen. Pause. And now write down as many of the words as you can remember. If you can keep them in order, that's even better. But if you can't, at least write down what all the words are. All right, and now I'm not concerned with order at all. Write down every word you can think of. Everything that's from the list. Have a look at your list. Do you have the word injection on there? That was the last item you showed. Good chance that you remember that. That's called recency. Something you've read about possibly in the book. Do you have thread on there? That was the first item. That's called a primacy effect. Do you have the word point? Probably not. That was a middle item. Those tend to kind of fall away. Let's do a recognition test. Did you see the word bed? Yes or no? Answer for yourself. Did you see the word sewing? Yes or no? Did you see the word deer? Yes or no? Did you see the word needle? Yes or no? And that will conclude the test. I'll give you the answers. You did not see bed. You did see sewing. You did not see deer. And what did you answer for needle? Did you say that you did? Because you actually did not see the word needle. Does your free recall list include needle? That would be neat. It's possible. A little less likely. But this is all based on a paradigm originally posited by Dease in 1959 and later resurrected by Roediger and McDermott in the 90s. So they call it the DRM paradigm. Basically what you do here is you present a list to somebody of words that are related in meaning. So one example would be a list that was something like bed, rest, awake, tired, dream, blanket, doze. And then you give them a recognition memory test. And that test includes some words that are on the list, like rest, tired, dream, in this example. You give them some unrelated distractors, let's say cake, mountain, cloth. And then you give them a semantically related distractor around which the word list is based. Semantic, fancy psych word for meaning. Now when you do this, these related distractors are reported almost as often as words that were actually on the list. And when people report them as having been on the list, they have high confidence that they were on the list and that they are correct about it having been on the list. They even report specifically remembering, like they feel like they can imagine the word needle or the word, sleep on the screen in front of them, even though they never saw it. And it happens even if you know about the effect. It's another one of those cognitive psych effects that pretty much always works. And again, this is maybe the best example of what a memory network is. It is a network of information based around meaning that activates itself interactively. So when you think about a haystack and an injection, and you get the word point and sharp and sewing, eye, pin, thread, all these things just really activate the network surrounding the word and the concept of needle in your mind. It's everything about needles except for the word needle itself. So the word needle is really, really hot by the time you get to the end, which makes it very easy to falsely remember having seen the word needle. Now, if you're feeling glum about your memory at the end of this video, I want to give you one last bit of uplifting advice. Dan Schachter in The 7 Sins of Memory, a great book that you should buy if you're curious about these things, wrote that we should not think of these, in his case, the sins, and in our case here, this structure of reconstructive activation and those sorts of things, as flaws in the architecture of memory, but as costs we pay for the benefits that make it work as well as it does most of the time.